Fantastic. Welcome everyone to Earth Laws, the Rights of Nature and Indigenous First Laws, hosted by the TEC for International Mother Earth Day 2025. My name is Mark Thurl. I'm one of the campaigners at the Total Environment Centre, or TEC for short, and I'm joined by Taylor Shaw, our Projects and Events Manager. First and foremost, our acknowledgement of country. Okay. Taylor and I are joining virtually from Gadigal lands, and on behalf of ourselves and TEC, we acknowledge the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land. We acknowledge their continuing connection to land, waters and community, and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We'd like to extend this acknowledgement and our respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which participants are joining online also. So we'd invite you to privately reflect on the traditional custodians' continuing connection with country, wherever you may be located. We acknowledge that this land was never ceded. So today's webinar is the first of our Rights of Nature campaign. This session will be recorded with a link to follow via email. We've got three fantastic guest speakers, and after they've spoken, I'll give you a glimpse at our initial plans before seeking your thoughts and insights and contributions that'll help shape our emerging campaign. If we have time, we'll do a brief Q&A, and Taylor's tending the chat, so please feel free to send questions throughout the session. If we can't get to them today, we'll do our best to point you in the right direction of an answer after the event. For those of you who are new to the TEC, we're an independent non-profit that's been fiercely advocating for the environment since 1972, pushing the transition to a greener, fairer world. We empower community groups, commission independent research, and engage with the media, stakeholders and decision makers through constructive debates. We focus on long-term environmental advocacy campaigns, supporting systemic change and raising public awareness. So I'd like to thank you all for turning up today, personally, especially after a big long weekend, to discuss this important and exciting issue. I'm sure everyone online would agree, in a moral sense, species, ecosystems, and nature have intrinsic rights to exist and flourish. So the question is often, why isn't this status properly reflected in our laws or our society? Today, we're going to hear a little about the legal history and the mindset that's inhibited appropriate recognition. And we'll hear some examples from around the world and Australia of communities and lawmakers finding ways to better recognise these rights. It's a very exciting worldwide development. Recently, the Anima Mundi initiative reported that they'd tracked 400 examples of laws and practices around the world that were recognising rights of nature in one form or another. From constitutional recognition of Mother Earth in Ecuador, granting rivers and geographical areas legal personhood in New Zealand, or recently a treaty amongst Pacific Indigenous leaders recognising whales and dolphins as legal persons. The potential applications of these ideas are truly transformative. And it's fitting that today we discuss these issues, because today is, of course, the 22nd of April, Mother Earth Day. Earth Day has been recognised since the 1970s in America as a day to demonstrate support for environmental protection. But less well known is that in 2009, the United Nations General Assembly formally adopted the 22nd of April as International Mother Earth Day to recognise that not only was the Earth and its ecosystems our home, but in order to achieve a just balance among the economic and social and environmental needs of present and future generations, we need to promote harmony with nature and the Earth. And that's the essence of today in many ways, protecting nature and harmony with nature as a part of nature. Where these moral rights are ignored by decision makers, we get unbalanced decisions, and without balance, there can be no harmony. So I'd like to welcome the first of our speakers, Dr. Michelle Maloney and Dr. Mary Graham. They'll be providing a joint presentation on Earth laws and Indigenous first laws. Dr. Mary Graham has been recognised as one of Australia's leading Aboriginal philosophers. She's a community development leader, an elder, an educator, a fellow director of Future Dreaming Australia with Michelle Maloney, an adjunct associate professor in political science at the University of Queensland. She's a Kombumerri person on her father's heritage and a Waka Waka clan through her mother's heritage, and she's a dedicated lecturer at the University of Queensland. Her contributions to this area are too lengthy to list. One recent work I draw your attention to is her contribution to the Declaration of Peace for Indigenous Australians and Nature, a legal pluralist approach to first laws and earth laws, which was a fantastic read. So really grateful to have Dr. Mary Graham here with us today. We also have Dr. Michelle Maloney, who's an author, lawyer, teacher, facilitator and campaigner. She's got a BA in B Laws from ANU and a PhD in Environmental Law and Regulation from Griffith University. She's co-founder and national convener of AELA, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, and co-founder and director of the New Economy Network Australia and Future Dreaming Australia. An adjunct fellow of the Institute of Sustainable Futures at UTS, and a member of the Advisory Council of GARN, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. In 2024, Dr. Michelle Maloney was recipient of the esteemed Peace Woman Award from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first two speakers, Dr. Michelle Maloney and Dr. Mary Graham.
Thank you so much. It's a real honour to be with you. Thank you for the invitation to join you. And I always get mildly embarrassed by long introductions. It always makes you sound far more flash than you really are, doesn't it? But thank you so much. I'm going to introduce Mary Graham, but put into context the way that Mary and I both present together. So if technology is on my side, the slides will come up. They are showing goodwill so far. So thank you again for welcoming us and having this really important conversation. And I'm really delighted to be here with Mary Graham and Erin O'Donnell, two people whose work I greatly admire. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the beautiful lands of the Cubby Cubby peoples. And where that is north of Brisbane, up in the Moreton Shire Council area. From up behind my hill, I look out over a different but similar view of the Glasshouse Mountains, and that's actually Jinnaburra country. So I'd like to acknowledge that as a descendant of non-Indigenous people brought to this continent as part of the colonisation of the lands here, I spend all of my days being grateful for the First Nations people's care and governance of this amazing continent that I'm now privileged to live on. I'd like to acknowledge the First Peoples, their ongoing ways and rules and connections for caring for country. And I'd also like to acknowledge that land was never ceded through through treaty or in any other way. And the work that I do in Future Dreaming, in AELA, with Mary, with many other good friends, is about how do we be good earthlings on this continent. And these are some of the framings that guide some of the ways we talk and teach, the work we do, introducing folks to thinking about different ways of caring for country. Clicky thing. So in a moment, I'll be honoured to introduce Mary Graham because, and then I'll be speaking after Mary. But when it comes to talks about rights of nature, it's really nice for us to kind of introduce what we're going to do together. Because sometimes people come into these talks assuming we're going to go straight into what are rights of nature, how do we do these things in the Australian legal system. But what's really important to know in a country like Australia, with such an ongoing legacy of the colonisation of this place, is that there was a pre-existing legal system which continues today, first laws, the remarkable and ancient governance system that has cared for country and cared for people since time immemorial. And what Mary Graham can share insights into is a very different way of looking at the human relationship with the living world and how their governance system continues to guide thinking and action today. And then what I'll talk about is the rights of nature movement as it's challenging Western law and what it could mean in Australia. And then that's a beautiful segue to Erin's really terrific work. And I'll let her talk about that. I won't speak for her. But what I wanted to do before Mary speaks and before I speak in detail is a quick snapshot for people who might be new to thinking about rights of nature. So the rights of nature movement has, in technical terms, arisen as a reaction to Western law. It may be integrated with Indigenous thinking in other places, but it is still first and foremost, in its early origins, which I'll talk about, a reaction to the way that Western law and governance treats nature as property. And the reason this is very important to remember is that for other cultural groups around the world, including Aboriginal peoples, they didn't need and don't need, in many aspects in the traditional system, rights-based approaches because they already have their own integrated legal system that works in a different way. So we will talk about rights of nature, but we will talk about it in a way that how do we make some of these ideas appropriate in the Australian context? The nitty-gritty of how particular legal approaches work, that can be discussed too, but it's really important to note that we already have first laws in this country, and that the way Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples connect with country are guided by the living rhythm and pattern of place is still really one of the go-to places for knowledge and systems understanding. So that's our introduction to both our sessions, because I've been in places overseas, particularly where US and other advocates go straight into how do we make a rights of nature law work in this jurisdiction without actually asking what's already going on in that place. So that's why these conversations are so important. So now I'd like to hand over to Mary, and Mary will either introduce herself or go straight into her talk. And I've got a few slides because Mary always likes to show the map of Australia from the Aboriginal perspectives. Thank you very much. Back soon.
Well, thank you. I'd like to also appreciate my appreciation and thanks for inviting us here on this webinar. It's so important and it's so valuable to do with the earth, you know, and it's a regular thing. And I wish it would be more regular, as in not just yearly, or if it is yearly, but more so, and more known and loud and spread everywhere and so on, you know. Thinking about just offhand a media, perhaps media that was concentrated more on the well-being of the earth, you know, in that way or different ways like that. But what I did want to start off with, as I said earlier, about perhaps could I put forward a question to Michelle, which we've talked about this before. The first two-parter really, the idea of rights. I have a vague idea about where that came from, but you stand that question up besides the idea of the obligations to the environment, and that's what more or less what Indigenous people really look at, rather than rights. So obligations and rights. We would go with obligations, not so much rights, you know, simply because of the logical difficulty about it, as in rights. You have a whole list or array of rights. Sooner or later, they're going to conflict with each other, and they do regularly. So that particular, if that could be spoken about more. The other part of that is among ourselves, we know that we just know, it's a traditional thing, that the land is the source of the law, Aboriginal law, which is again a two-parter, LAW, two sides of the same coin. The law, LAW, the rules, the general rules, social and political, spiritual too, and the LORE is the creative dreaming stories and narratives of how all of that came together. You know, the history of it and what happened and the stories and so on and so on. So the land is the source of the law. And I've always wondered about what is the source of Western law? Is it anything at all to do with the environment, or is it something else entirely? So that's what I've always, and I don't know if you want to engage already, Michelle, by saying something.
Yeah, and thank you, Mary. I'll talk about it in my talk. Yeah. Well, I want to hear from you, but I'm very happy to talk about it with you. Mary and I and Irene Watson had this conversation several years ago. What is the source of Western law or English law or Australian law? And if you speak to a black letter lawyer, they'll talk about concepts like the Grund norm and all of these interesting ideas. But interestingly, the more history you do about the law and how it's emerged in Australia from the early British law, is then if you go into the history of British law, it's a couple of thousand years old in terms of its hierarchies, but post the leaving of Great Britain from by the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons and others started to build a kind of absolutely human-centered law focused on property law, property rights, and it was structured certain ways. Then in 1066, the Norman invasion brought a very French approach to some aspects of feudalism. And then you can look throughout the all of those many centuries through the Tudor England and everything else. And what you will see all the time, Mary, is rights-based approach, but in a hierarchical structure. There was no reference to Mother Nature as an entity. Certainly you had your pastoral communities, your peasants, your farmers with their calendars of the seasons. And because someone once said to me, oh, they were very connected to the earth. I said it was a different relationship, though, because it was all about what they could glean from their harvest. Pre-Roman, some of the settlements have been shown to have had a very earth-based culture, and there's mystery about the Druids. But if you want the hard nuts and bolts of where does modern law come from the West, there's a very unique way that laws emerged in Europe, particularly through when the collapse of the Roman Empire. You were seeing kingdoms and fiefdoms and feudalism build in lots of different ways in lots of different places. There was some element of communal sharing because of the relationship, but it was hierarchical, and the law was between people. And then, let's be honest, most of the laws emerged to protect property. And I remember doing the stats. We did it in a decolonisation talk on how many convicts who were brought to Australia were actually here because of property-related crime, and it was something like 80% of all the people who came over had stolen something from somebody rich or trespassed.
Oh, really?
So the early origins of Western law, in a simple way, are a mishmash of ideas through the mishmash of invasions in Great Britain, but absolutely not embedded in an ecological understanding of place at all. There are cultural aspects entrenched, but not,
So,
thanks.
So yeah, no, thanks very much. I have to be told that all the time, actually, because I keep I don't know, you get caught up in it to do with crazy things like native title and all kinds of things, and it just makes you more both more confused and angry, and so it's like going around in circles trying to understand it, and between our two different laws, and so on. But ours starts with relationalism, essentially, very briefly, because we haven't got much time, I guess. The land invents everything. It invented us. It threw us up into the world. And there's a long story about that, but I won't, which includes Africa and so on, which I agree with, as I often say. I agree with two opposing truths. I agree about the from Africa or out of Africa thing. Plus, I agree with the original idea that we became human in this country, and they seem like total contradictions, but they're both right. And I'm sorry, I won't go into exactly how, but I agree with both. The idea of becoming human is a long, what I call a long view. You take it into account about the beginnings of the machine, in a sense, the bones, and so on, and you end up with people who are physically and reflectively human, who start asking, who am I and where do I come from and what is all this around about, with the meaning of things and so on. So long story. So when we say where the land invented us, in the words of old people, the land grew us up, they'll say. It grew us up just like a small child. So an early human being growing up into an adult, fully developed, placed human being. So it starts off with relationalism in that sense, the very first cab off the rank, if you like, in those terms. It invents us. It continues to look after us, both with, of course, all the obvious resources and foods and so on and so on. We, at some point, learn to reciprocate. So it's a reciprocal relationship that starts and developing over a very long period of time talking about tens of thousands of years. And then after a while, you get to understand that there's a meaning of life to do with this, that the land is not necessarily like a godlike thing. It's a real thing. You eat its food, you get its resources, you walk on it. It's got all kinds of shapes and so on and so on. Regionalism. The idea of regionalism comes from this. This all different kinds of lands and people, different mobs on different kinds of lands, finding themselves there and becoming a deep, very deep set identity with that particular land, and never being interrupted except by environmental processes occasionally. The sea reclaiming land and earthquakes and volcanoes going off, that kind of thing. But that's essentially what it is in those words up there: place-based, sacralized. I'll say it in the way I was trying to work out a quick way of saying it, short. Sorry. So a sacralized, ecological, collaborative, self what's that word? Self-regulating, a self-regulating system, a stewardship system. That's, in a nutshell, that's actually what our system is. So it isn't religious, nothing to do with religion or ideology or even philosophy, but a philosophy in the sense of a view of life, a worldview, that sort of philosophy, I suppose. And it's it's self-regulating. So as in no state, no hierarchy, in other words, no even different kind of hierarchy of all sorts, pharaohs, Rome, emperors, and so on and so on. So it's a flat system and it's gender-based, balanced. So governance. So there is some thought now that perhaps maybe Aboriginal people might have even invented governance, the notion of governance. When you look at that, that is a governance system, whether you recognize it or not. Those various regions, they're not like states or mini states, and there are no such things as, fences or guards at every step and so on and so on. It's a relationalism, which has come from being born by Earth, has worked out into this idea of what do you call it? Autonomous regard. Autonomous regard, how we get on with each other, how we aim for stability rather than security. Now, not to the exclusion of security, but the path to security is stability, basically. So you aim for stability over a long period of time, and then you end up with security. There's two different forms of security, though. The original security, where the very thing that has invented us can be quite scary. So earthquakes going off, things like that. All you can do is run, run for your life. That's the basic physical security that you have to have. But how to meet those sorts of dangers is in the kind of collective system that we have. A friend of mine made this quote about our system being a long-term experiment in human order making. It's exactly what it is, in human order making. How did they do that? So over a long period of time, that's this kind of relationalism and survivalism. And so survivalism is all from small scale, middle to large scale. Small scale is you've got to look after yourself. Crossing the road, you might end up getting hit by a bus. So attend to the rules. So rules are important all the way along. All the way along, you make up these rules, and they're rules to do with the whole of life, to do with the spiritual and the physical and the practical and then so on and so on. The large scale, of course, is wars, revolutions, all that sort of thing. People are running for their life. What Aboriginal people worked out is the idea of relationalism being used as a counter to survivalist persuasions or threats of things like this. So the more you depend on relationalism, the better it is. You can't avoid survivalism. By saying that, survivalism meaning conflict to the idea of conflict. The idea of having conflict is a normal, natural thing because we got egos, and sooner or later if we don't fight about something, we'll find something to fight about. So it's just a natural part of being human. So work out really very well thought out, clever ways of managing conflict, not just let it go, not just let it happen and you immediately run to survivalism. Survivalism meaning you think you're alone in the world. You have to protect yourself both psychologically, militarily, physically, spiritually, politically, all kinds of ways. You tend to think that that's what the meaning of life is. That's not what the meaning of life is for Aboriginal people, for many Indigenous people actually. But you have to work out how do you get on with each other. Now, that doesn't mean how to be good, how to be virtuous. Not we're all joining hands and singing Kombumerri or anything like that. You have these particular views or ways of connecting with each other. One of them is autonomous regard. We are all autonomous beings, and women are definitely autonomous beings. And this is where this governance, this gender balance governance, is a real thing in the old system. So men and women run society together as equals, like just quite in balance. I prefer the word balance rather than equal because equality always sounds forced, and sooner or later somebody gets pissed off and starts arguing about this equality or somebody is missing out or something like that, so stay with balance because it's always an ever moving thing, and that's.
Has Mary frozen for you? Yeah, me too. Bugger. I was just about to speak with her and wrap things up. That's all right. We'll come back to questions if that's all right. I can continue if you like. Might be because Mary always asks me to keep time because we both, and I ask her to keep an eye on me because we both chat too much. But let me bring back the slides and hopefully we'll have Mary come back and join us in just a minute. Can everyone see my slides? Yeah, and I'm sorry, someone asked about the black squares on the screen. That's it's a weird thing with Zoom at the moment. It's showing the menu bars, so forgive me if that's what you can see. So what I normally do is I kind of have a quick chat with Mary and then we move into the stuff that I talk about. So what I would like to do for you, and I'll do it as quickly as I can because to be quite honest, there's so much material in this topic. What I'll do is scoot over some of these issues so that you can get familiar with them and we can always all come back together again later and have a discussion about some of the more detailed aspects of this work. And I'm sure you'll have heaps of questions for Erin too.
Sorry.
You okay, Mary? Yeah.
Yes.
We've just got to keep moving, Mary, but I'll come back to you. I've been segueing to my talk, if that's all right, matey. Yeah, and I don't know if she can hear me. Anyway, sorry. So I'm going to talk about what are rights of nature and break it down in fairly simple terms. So forgive me if you already know a lot of this. And then a few examples, not so much to cover the many dozens of things popping up around the world, but to perhaps give some of you an introduction to the different ways that different communities or jurisdictions and laws are taking on some of these notions. And then I won't speak to it too much, but I often come back to this point of, well, why has the rights of nature movement even emerged? And we'll talk about some of that and what's possible in Australia, which is a really excellent connecting point to the work that Erin is involved in. The Australian Earth Laws Alliance is interested in earth-centred governance. So I want to say up front that our passion is about ecocentric everything. And if you think of what we're interested in as a tree with branches, on the one hand, we're inspired by critiques of Western systems, particularly things like Earth Jurisprudence by Thomas Berry in his book, The Great Work, because it's looking at the Western constructs of law economics, education, and other systems. But of course, being in Australia, asking what it is to be a good earthling in modern times means that not only should we pay respects to First Laws and First Nations peoples, but there is so much to learn and so much we can do together into the future. So the organisation that I'm part of, AELA, is interested in all aspects of ecocentrism. Rights of nature is one thread within that weave. So what are rights of nature? You may not be surprised to know that a simple way to explain rights of nature laws is that they are laws that aim to change the legal status of nature from just being human property to being recognised as rights-bearing entities of their own. And at first, unless you really dig around and get an understanding, and Mary's question at the beginning was perfect, because where does law come from? Western law is its own thing. Not everyone has that system of law, and it is fundamentally built around human beings and their rights and obligations to each other, and much more about rights and obligations. Rights of nature itself, as I mentioned, is one thread within a larger weave, and there's a lot of emerging ecocentric law and governance ideas and work, which is absolutely fantastic. The last 20 years have seen a remarkable growth in thinking from folks in the legal, governance, and even the economic sector, which was already ahead through things like ecological economics. So if you think of a really simple umbrella, there's a lot of different concepts and terms. Some people call them different things. I always suggest don't get too hung up on some of the labels. You have some people calling ecological jurisprudence, others call it earth jurisprudence, others have different ways of framing. But rights of nature as an idea is actually separate from legal personhood for nature, and there's lots of different ways that they intersect. And for those who know about ecocide, that's people advocating for large-scale destruction of environment to be recognised as an actual crime, which it isn't, shockingly. Anyway, and then, of course, the other side of the umbrella in Australia, as we've already said, we can't just look at these emerging concepts that are inside Western law. We have to also be thinking, well, we don't want to just continue colonial patterns of law. How do we focus on learning from the systems that are already here and respecting the ongoing legal relationships that people have with country? So, a couple of quick summaries of stuff, and I'll come back to some examples. Where have rights of nature laws emerged? So many places, I can't list them all. There's a fantastic, I meant to put the link in, there's a great resource called the Eco Jurisprudence Monitor, and it lists all of the laws and different policies emerging and existing around the world. Quick story though, the very first rights of nature laws appeared in local communities in the US, where they were asserting their rights as local people to protect their local environment and asserting the rights of nature to exist. And that is the essence of some of the early Western-style rights of nature work. But then in 2017, New Zealand's passing of a special law under the Treaty of Waitangi, which then suddenly said, we see this river as a legal person, that really changed the game, and a lot of people started to see things very differently. When you're thinking about rights of nature, there's always lots of different ways you can do it. Here are some simple questions, and I'll come back to them when I touch on some examples. So what you might want to think about is who or what has rights? Is it a river? Is it a forest? Is it a bumblebee? What rights does it have? And this will always depend on what people create in their written instruments or what they refer to inside their laws of obligation. But that's a different story. Who can enforce these rights? And what impact does it have? Does it make any difference at all? And this was certainly a question we used to get in the early days. When I started looking at rights of nature work, all we had to look at were a handful of local community ordinances in the US in 2006, 2007, and the Ecuadorian Constitution, which emerged in 2008. And obviously there's been an explosion since those days. And coming back to rights, which connects with what Mary has mentioned before, what are they anyway? In Western thinking, we often think that they're absolutely fundamental to society. So rights are legal, social, or ethical entitlements, a right to life, a right to work, a right to be free from pain. Rights are seen as essential to law and justice in our system. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says that rights structure the form of governments and the content of laws and the shape of morality. But it's really, really important to know that not all cultural legal systems around the world have rights as the starting point for their system. As Mary would talk about in longer sessions and in workshops, the idea that people are born into caring for country and are born into specific obligations builds a very different outlook on people's attitudes to country and their ways of handling disputes and their ways of doing the practice and doing the work. So not all cultures center rights. And even in the early days, back in 2011, when I started talking about rights of nature in Australia as just a concept to think about, there were a lot of Australians going, oh, rights, that's an American thing, that we don't talk that way in Australia. So it's a really interesting cultural perspective. Anyway, so quickly, some examples of rights of nature around the world. And like everyone, I'm feeling the speediness required here is not doing it all justice. In a nutshell, rights of nature and other kinds of ways of changing the legal status of nature, like legal personhood, are appearing and emerging in lots of different ways in lots of different places. But what I want to do is use my tree again for those who aren't hugely interested in the detail of law, but they want to know what's possible in their thinking. Think about it this way. You've got a big tree. The large trunk that's emerging is all about changing the legal status of nature in Western law. So it's not just property. It's not just something that human beings can protect or destroy, that it's an entity of its own. That's the core idea. What we saw in the early years of the rights of nature movement was declarations of the rights of nature across an entire jurisdiction, a local council area, or in 2008, Ecuador with its constitutional provisions, Section 71 and others, saying all of nature in this place has a right to exist, thrive, and evolve. And that often involves things like open standing. So anyone can take a case and speak for nature if they meet the requirements of whatever the laws are. But then, as I mentioned in 2017, the New Zealand example really was a game changer. Suddenly it was saying completely different origin. It wasn't about rights of nature. It was about Maori people standing up for their rights and their loss of lands through compensation agreements under the Treaty of Waitangi. But what it did, and a lot of people today still call it a rights of nature approach. What they actually said was the government said, well, we're not giving you back the river. It's important. We need it in our system. And they said, we're not signing a compensation agreement unless you do. Then somebody else said, why don't we make the river own itself? And so the legal construct they grabbed was this idea of legal personhood. So the river was basically is recognized as having the same legal rights as a corporation. There's a whole bunch of reasons about how that's done, why that's done. But what's interesting is they set up a structure of guardianship, and I know that Erin will be able to talk about that in more detail because of her experiences with her work. But in a nutshell, whereas rights of nature across a whole jurisdiction, so let's say a miracle happened and Queensland decided that it was going to declare first laws and rights of nature, then everyone in Queensland would have a right to it. But if we said this river in this place has rights, then you have to think about, do you go down a narrow guardianship structure or do you go to a mix of open standing to protect it? How do you do all this stuff? So rights for an ecosystem are this other branch. And in response, there was a lot of concern, actually. A lot of people were worried that saying nature was had the same rights as a corporation, which is just to own property and to sue and be sued, wasn't really sufficient for what a river really is. And then we saw the emergence of still an ecosystem approach. That's why it's that branch with the Atrato River in Colombia and other places where they were saying, we're not just going to give it legal personhood rights. We're going to acknowledge it is the subject of rights, and we're going to say what those rights are and who can speak for that. So I'm just going to jump ahead. So when you come back to those questions, who or what has rights? In Ecuador, they would say that all of nature has a right to exist. And then the court cases that come in or the discussions that come in are trying to balance different rights. But when it comes to the Whanganui River, who or what has rights? The river has rights, but it's only the Maori guardians and the government reps who can technically speak as guardians for the river. So you can see the difference. I won't go into all of that. I won't go into that either. We don't have time. Why has the rights of nature movement emerged? and again, I always try to remind people, put Western law into its context, because everyone thinks that law equals Western law, and it doesn't. Imagine the world in 1400. It was a patchwork quilt of biocultural governance and law. This is North America on the right. This is South America on the left. Most of the planet was a patchwork quilt of biocultural governance. And these are and were legal systems. But then this little corner of the world decided to march across the rest of the planet through colonization. And as we know in Australia, they brought with them, the British Empire brought with them, a very different legal system. And what I would argue, until there's no breath left in my body, it's a legal system that is perfectly suited to medieval England, because it's all about property ownership, hierarchical structures, top-down centralized control, but it's not suitable for the 21st century in any place. Because even with our environmental laws, as this poor cousin introduced in the 1970s, the systems aren't working. So Western law treats nature as human property. It still does this in Australia. It might be property we protect, national park, or an animal we care about, or it could be property that we wreck, destroy, or eat. It's still fundamentally seen through the lens of Western law property. Opportunities for changing the legal system in Australia. I'm thrilled that Erin will have time to talk about the Birrarung Council, a wonderful example in Australia of really good ways of developing new ideas. But what I wanted to mention before I stop talking is the challenges we face in Australia are pretty significant. We have an incredibly stable legal system. That's great. It means we don't have military coups every 3 years and, you know, people being destroyed and such. Well, I should reframe that. In modern times, the colonial laws are keeping some people mostly safe. Let's put it that way. But what it means is for the kinds of radical law reform some people want to see, whether it's rights of nature or first laws put into place as the law, it's incredibly difficult to change laws in Australia. The challenges are that nature is still human property. First laws have some recognition since the mid-1990s due to native title, which is flawed, but showing that legal pluralism is actually happening in Australia. We also have a backwards way of looking at the environment. It has always been a space for, let's do whatever we want, because we're living in the abstract world. We're not really connected to place. We're just going to go out and cut all those trees down and build a house, and then we'll fix it up later. We literally have nothing like what Aboriginal people had, which was a vision and an idea and an understanding of the moral entity we live in and what all component parts look like when they're managed well. We don't have that in our system. That's why I'm interested in bioregional stuff. Then the other thing to remember, ladies and gentlemen, is we don't have a right of stewardship or a right to defend local ecosystems. We have lots of convoluted things inside our planning system that may or may not allow people to stand up and try to stop an unwanted development or change an unwanted development. But we're not coming at this. Our legal system does not come at our environmental care in this country as a voice for nature or a voice for local communities. These are the things that we still have to challenge and fight for. Margot Neal in her Songline series talks about the third archive. Mary Graham and Morgan Briggs refer to this in their book, and I find it a lovely framing for saying, what could we build in Australia that's unique and different to everywhere else? There's lots of things we can do: movement building, bioregional collaborations, test cases, draft laws, and so on and so forth. There's stuff going on in Penrith and the Horseshoe River. There's other people in the Clarence River and the Macleay River. Lots of interest. Oh my gosh, too much to talk about. Thank you. That's enough from me. The end.
Good one.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Mary. That was
Yes,
hugely
yes.
I'm sorry we're on such a tight time frame that we had to cram
Sorry.
it all in so quickly. But well, thanks for sharing those. I'll move on to our next speaker, Dr. Erin O'Donnell. Erin's a senior lecturer and ARC research fellow at the University of Melbourne Law School. She's a water law and policy expert. She's recognised internationally for her research into legal rights for rivers. And since 2018, she's been a member of the Birrarung Council, the voice for the Yarra River in Melbourne. She's worked in partnership with traditional owners across Australia on a range of projects. One of her books that I've had the pleasure of reading was the Legal Rights for Rivers, Competition, Collaboration and Water Governance, which is well worth a read also. I'll hand you over to Dr. Erin O'Donnell.
Thanks very much, Mark. Let me try and share my screen. All right, so hopefully that is now coming up. Okay. Now, is it doing the weird thing where it's got the little black boxes all over it? Seeing people shake their heads. So hopefully that's...
No, it seems to be fine. It seems to be only my computer that's sabotaging my effort to communicate. Go, girl.
Excellent. All right. So I'm going to try and move through this fairly quickly as well and give us a little bit of time for discussion at the end, and picking up on quite a few of the threads from Michelle and Auntie Mary. So I'm going to be focusing in on a specific branch of this conversation around the rights of nature, and particularly looking at rivers, which is where my research focuses, and also the idea of living entity and how that differs from the idea of personhood and rights, and how it brings us into this space of obligation that Auntie Mary was talking about before. I will begin also with an acknowledgement of country. So I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Gardabanut people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I acknowledge that they have never ceded their rights to care for these lands and waters. I will also acknowledge that we are in the midst of a live-streamed genocide. So I stand in solidarity with the peoples of Palestine. I know that this is a tough time for everyone, so I also stand in solidarity with Jewish people living here in Australia and around the world who are experiencing anti-Semitism, but I also acknowledge that that's a different thing to what is happening in Palestine right now. So the question or the thread that I'm going to pick up from Michelle and Mary is this idea of what the problem is that we're trying to solve when we think about changing the legal status of nature. And again, building on that conversation about what law is, it helps me to begin with this question of, well, what does colonial water law do to the way that we relate to rivers? And it constructs water in a very specific and hierarchical way. It says water is an object, it's nothing more than a resource that is available for human, and by that we largely mean settler, capture and exploitation. So in the context of Australia, water law, like all our laws, tends to assume that there were no other laws, there are no other laws, and it operates by erasing legal pluralism. So water in settler colonial law is therefore only visible and legible or understandable to law as an object over which humans have total dominion. Now, we do have limits that we have self-imposed on the way that our dominion is exercised to try and protect ecosystems, but those limits are pretty few and far between, and they're very easily evaded. So if you look around at the state of waterways across Australia, clearly those limits are not leading to the kind of sustainable outcomes we would like to see. So the question that I have and that motivates my research is what it would look like to bring ourselves back into good relations with water. And I've put back in brackets there because I think settlers have never had good relations with water in this country. But as Uncle Dave Wandon, a Wurundjeri elder, likes to remind us, we are all Indigenous to somewhere. So at some point in my history as a settler person here in Australia, my people have had good relations with the waters of their origins. We know how to do this. It's just that as settlers, we haven't done it yet. And the quote here comes from Cleo Wolfel-Hazard's book, Underflows, which is a fantastic book. And they write about what it would take for us to understand and accept rivers as willful, unruly, feeling and acting beings. And so this is a lovely way of understanding what a living entity construction of a river could look like. I won't spend too long here because I think we've had a little bit of a look around the world, but it's really just to highlight that as we look around the world, nature is gaining all kinds of legal status, as Michelle talked about. And a lot of these specific examples relate to rivers and waterways, rivers, lakes, wetlands. There's something about watery places that really inspires people to come together and try and find these still quite radical ways of protecting them. And again, to pick up on what Michelle was saying, there's a bunch of different ways that this is happening. And so again, I like to think about it in terms of these 4 classifications. If we think about legal personhood as something that is quite comfortable within a common law construct like Australia or Britain or the US or Canada, a legal person is like a corporation. A human being can be a legal person, but there's an assumed bundle of rights that a legal person has. And it tends to be things like legal standing, so the ability to go to court, to sue and be sued, to own property, to enter into and enforce contracts. There are a bunch of other rights that can also be attached to a legal person, but those are the core rights that we tend to assume go with it. The subject of rights is an idea that comes to us out of what we call civil law jurisdictions, and they are other forms of Western legal systems. The subject of rights is very similar to a legal person, except that it doesn't have the assumed rights. What it does have is tremendous flexibility to have specific rights articulated and attached to it. And so we see that in places like Colombia, for instance, where rivers are articulated as the subject of rights with very specific rights to conservation, maintenance, and protection. The living person is a relatively novel and not widely applied idea. We see it coming through in a lot of the South Asian jurisprudence on the rights of rivers and the rights of nature. The living person is where Western law gets a bit confused, because the only living person that Western law recognises is the human being. And so when we start to extend this classification of living person to other natural entities, then you can get some very creative legal responses. And the one that I always like to point to, and forgive me if you've heard me say this before, is the Yamuna River in India. When it was recognised as both a legal person and a living person, an environmental NGO immediately filed a police report for the homicide of the river, because they argued that if the river was classified as biologically dead, but was recognised in the eyes of the law as a living person, then someone must have killed it. So there is capacity for creativity in there. There is also capacity for confusion. And we can talk a little bit about that in the questions as well, if that's of interest. And then finally, at the bottom here, we have the idea of a living being or living entity. We'll talk a bit about that because that's the example that Australia is using. This is not a legally powerful idea when it comes to Western law. So a living being doesn't necessarily have the rights that a legal person or the subject of rights might have. So that a living entity can't necessarily go to court and sue to protect its own interests. But what it does do is say, this is a living creature. And so you are now in a relationship with a living being. And I think it brings in what Mary was talking about in terms of relationalism. It says, once you recognise the world around you or specific elements of it, like a river or a lake, as being alive, it fundamentally changes the nature of your relationship. It doesn't necessarily make it impossible, but it starts to move us out of this space of exploitation and dominance and into a space of trying to understand what our relationship is and inviting us to consider whether our relationship is one that we are happy with. So against that idea then of living person, I also want to just talk briefly about some of the pitfalls that can come with legal rights, and specifically legal personhood, but really any form of really pronounced, powerful legal rights. What we see in those circumstances is that environmental protection will go up. Once you have these legal rights, you do increase the legal power that a natural entity has. And so rivers, for example, with legal rights and legal personhood can take more action to better protect their rights, to better protect their ecosystem health and their well-being. But people can become less likely to want to protect them. And that's for two main reasons. Firstly, we find it a bit easy to abdicate our responsibilities. So once we recognise somebody else as a rights holder with the ability to look after themselves, then we start to say, well, that's your job. It's not really my job anymore. And that's a terrible way of thinking. It's not just an abdication of responsibility, it is actually a further shredding of our relationship with the natural world around us. So that willingness to abdicate our responsibility is a reaction that we need to watch and manage for. And so this goes back to the question I began with, is what is the problem you're trying to solve? If you need these legal rights, then sometimes you have to go ahead and create them. If you need to get your natural entity into court, for instance, but you need to be aware that this abdication of responsibility can happen. The second thing is that people become afraid. And this is, I'm going to possibly misquote, but I'm going to attempt to quote from Mary here, the fearful freedom of the individual comes to the fore because we start seeing people with legal powers like our own and we start to react to the idea that nature is also a legally powerful entity. And so we seek to take it down before it can hold us accountable for the harm that we're doing it. So we can abdicate our responsibility or we can lash out in fear. Both of those things end up lowering the environmental protection outcomes. So what can we do instead? Here in Australia, the first and so far only river entity that has received rights is the Birrarung. It is a single living integrated natural entity. So it has these relational elements. It doesn't have those formal legal rights. The photo behind me is a picture of this river that I took on a sunny afternoon several years ago now. And the river is beautiful. It supplies about 70% of Melbourne's drinking water, so it is absolutely core to the city of Melbourne. People who live there, and I live there when I'm not down here in my little beach house, our lives are made possible because of the sacrifice this river makes on our behalf. So in 2017, this river was recognised as a single living natural entity in Victoria's first bilingual legislation. So the legislation is called the Yarra River Protection Act in English, or Willipjin Birrarung Maron in Woiwurrung language, which means keep the river alive, keep Birrarung alive. And there is a preamble in Woiwurrung language as well. To build on what Michelle was saying, when you recognise a river as a living entity, one of the questions you then need to ask yourselves is, well, who speaks for this river? Who brings the voice of the river into the human spaces where the river needs to be heard? And in the case of the Birrarung, that is the job of the Birrarung Council. And that's one of the hats that I wear, is to be a member of this council. There are mandated seats on the council for Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and Bunurong, the peoples of the river. And you can see in this photo, Wurundjeri Woiwurrung elders speaking on the floor of Parliament when this legislation was first introduced. As a voice for the river, we have two legislated responsibilities, which are to advise the Minister for Water. We have basically an integrity function, and I'll talk more about that in a second. We must advocate for the interests of the river. And we understand those two functions through the lens of a third function that we have crafted for ourselves, which means that we need to speak for the river sometimes, but also enable others to speak with the river. And again, that is what the living entity enables us to do by saying it's a living being. How do we cultivate relationships between as many people as possible and this river? This slightly complicated diagram gives you a little bit of an overview of how we got to where we are now. One of the key features of this legislation is this collaborative river management framework. So it brings together what are called responsible public entities, local governments, water authorities, Parks Victoria, so land managers, people who have responsibility, mainly for the lands. One of the big gaps in this legislation is it doesn't bring in all of the water authorities, but for the lands around the river, these are called responsible public entities, and they are required to follow this legislation and to give effect to the Burndat Birrarung Burndat Pumaku, which is the Yarra strategic plan. So this timeline just basically sets out a little bit of how we got to where we are. The origin of this is actually community activism. So the Yarra Riverkeeper took the then opposition leader, or opposition member, I should say, with responsibility for planning and environment and waterways, took them up the river on a boat and showed them the river from the river's perspective and said, do you understand now why we need new legislation to protect this river holistically? And that then became government policy. They won the election in 2014. The Act came out in 2017. The Birrarung Council was appointed in 2018. We had a new statutorily mandated 50-year community vision that was also launched in 2018 alongside a separate vision that was created by Wurundjeri Woiwurrung as the people of the river. This then set up for Burndat Birrarung Burndat Pumaku, which is a 10-year strategic plan to give effect to that 50-year community vision. And then every year since then, the Birrarung Council must issue a report to the Minister for Water by the 31st of October. And that minister has 7 parliamentary sitting days to table that report unedited in Parliament. So this is our integrity function, because every year we report on how all of those responsible public entities are actually doing at upholding and meeting the requirements of that Yarra strategic plan, Burndat Birrarung, Burndat Pumaku, and in upholding the community vision and working with the river as a living entity. So we have that kind of punctuated moment once a year where we shine a spotlight on what is happening. In between those kind of annual outcomes, we try and work with that community of responsible public entities to really build their capacity to engage with these concepts. So there are, you'll see in this diagram, a whole bunch of yarning circles that we hold with these entities. The yarning circles are run by the elders on the Birrarung Council, and they create a space for honest conversation about the challenges, but also the successes that people are having within this new government framing. The one final thing that I wanted to flag is, although the Act came out in 2017 and we had a couple of really important planning scheme amendments that came out initially, which were basically limiting development that was going to impact the river. So there was already an immediate impact of this particular piece of legislation on the health of the river. The one thing we really, really needed was a broader recognition in the planning scheme that decision makers needed to take this Act into account, particularly the principles that the Act has for protecting the river as a living entity. That was formally gazetted last week. So it did take a good 8 years, but we now have a significant piece of the puzzle that will make decisions a lot more focused on how they will improve things for the river. I'm going to skip through these, but I just wanted to highlight there is a shift in what we're seeing in the way that people engage with the river. We're shifting from this narrative of what we can get from the river into a conversation of what do we want for the river and how do we get that future? How do we work together with the river as a partner to produce the future that we want? And then the final takeaways that I would have for you in considering a future advocacy campaign around this, picking up again on what Michelle and Auntie Mary were saying, you need to centre relationships by partnering with Indigenous peoples. In a colonial context like Australia, that's core to any kind of conversation about changing the legal status of rivers or nature more generally. Strong governance needs to integrate these changes so that we actually can see significant impacts. Like, don't wait 8 years to get the planning scheme changes that you need. But on the other hand, don't be afraid of things that look like mere symbolism, because that can sometimes be the way that you need to begin to get things moving and to get real change.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Erin O'Donnell. That was hugely informative and wonderful to see the progress, particularly with the recently gazetted strategic plan changes, which we spoke about a couple of weeks ago. So that's great to hear that's come through. I'd like to thank all our speakers again one more time. We are a little over time, so we will take some of the questions and try and get back to everyone on those at a later date for any that we can't answer now, which I think we'll just move straight on to the next slide, because we would like to get a bit of everyone's feedback. We know it's ethically justifiable, the moral rights of species and ecosystems. We know they're not sufficiently recognised or protected by our current laws. We know that failure to recognise those rights can lead to unbalanced decision making, which means in turn we'll never reach the kind of harmony that the General Assembly was speaking about in 2009. So here's our call to action. We want your help. These ideas need to spread. While those who've thought deeply on this topic acknowledge those moral rights, this idea is not universally accepted across Australia. And neither are the ideas of living entities or legal personhood for non-human species. So TSC is obviously working on consciousness-raising efforts through social media, open dialogue, and future events. We'd like you to stay in touch with us, and of course, we'd like you to read more from the good work from other groups out there like AELA and GARN, Animate Mundi as well, we mentioned earlier today, and the Eco Jurisprudence Monitor. And today we'd also like your thoughts and insights into the rights of nature and what you'd like to see from our evolving campaign. So up here we've got a QR code, so you can use your mobile phone to take a photo of that, and that should lead you to a link with a survey. So you can tell us what you think and what you'd like to see. I'll also send a link around to everyone who's registered so they can provide their feedback that way, or you can email me directly afterwards as well. We want to cast quite a wide net to uncover as many possible ideas about avenues that might help to cultivate the rights of nature movement in Australia. So don't be afraid to share half thought out ideas or areas that you'd like to hear more about that might be a little different to what's been spoken about today. Anything from the corporate world, promoting nature on boards, and of course the key focus on those issues that have been raised today. We are well and truly over time.
Sorry, Mark, I hate to interrupt. Everyone's saying that you need a password for the QR code. I'm sure that would be disappointing to you. So did you guys have a password?
There is a password. It is TEC. Sorry about that. The passcode is TEC. So everyone can link it. Thanks very much for that, Michelle.
Okay.
And I hope everyone's got something nice planned for the afternoon for Mother Earth Day, whether it's just quiet reflection or getting out there into some nature. Until next time, thank you again for your participation, and a big thanks to Dr. Mary Graham, Dr. Michelle Maloney, and Dr. Erin O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mark. And we'd all be very happy to continue the conversation anytime you would like to have us back.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michelle. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.